Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for joining today. My name is Tomás Colonel. I am the current president of the CSCMP Roundtable in Spain, and it's a really pleasure to open this webinar we co-organized with our colleagues from the Portuguese Roundtable. We have ahead a really valuable hour focused on a key topic that impacts all supply chain globally. This is the source information. And we are very fortunate today. We have two outstanding panelists with us today, Daniel and Tom. And of course, always exceptional moderator Len here who will be guiding the discussion. So before starting, I will try to use the first 3 or 4 minutes to share what CSCMP is all about and what the community of CSCMP is. So to start with, CSCMP was founded in 1963 in the USA. The word stands for Supply Chain Management Professionals and is the preeminent professional association dedicated to the development and dissemination of research and knowledge on supply chain management. We have 3 very important pillars we are working constantly in, so it's connecting, developing, and educating. In our history, we have more than 200 events organized in the world and more than 65,000 attendees in our history. Our community is more than 10,000 members and spread in 40 roundtables around the world. Now we're going to see the footprint and where we are based in. And we have a very important track about education. Yeah, so we have the SC Pro certification and fundamentals. So this is great to keep us studying and developing our skills. As I mentioned regarding the footprint, of course, in the USA, we have more than 30 roundtables spread in all the regions. So feel free, of course, to reach anyone in this area if you are interested in connecting with people in the USA. And also we have in Europe, we have 10 roundtables in the UK, Germany, Spain, Switzerland, Sweden, Italy, Poland, Benelux, Ukraine, new one this year, Portugal. So it's great, guys. We have this first event co-organized together. Regarding membership, we have 4 types of membership based on the interest and the situation of each people. I'm not going to go into details about this, but here the important point to highlight is we can choose your journey and decide which type of members you would like to be. So we have a lot of options and opportunities for people to join the community. And to summarize all the things I just said, we have a very short video I would like to share with you. So I want to put play here.
In a world driven by supply chains, one organization has been leading the way since 1963. Founded in the USA, the Council of Supply Chain Management Professionals is the foremost authority dedicated to advancing supply chain knowledge worldwide. With over 100 roundtables, over 200 events annually, and a thriving community of 10,000 members. CSCMP educates, develops, and connects the foremost leaders in supply chain management. Elevate your professional credentials with our SC Pro Fundamentals Certificate Program, designed to set the standard in supply chain education. Join us at the annual EDGE Conference, where supply chain leaders unite to gain exclusive insights, experience cutting-edge innovations, and experience unparalleled networking opportunities. Break into vibrant professional communities, whether you're in the Americas, Europe, or beyond. Explore local and international CSCMP events to forge lasting professional relationships and advance your career. Choose your journey with CSCMP. From young professionals to retired experts, our membership options cater to every stage of your professional life. Explore our specialized benefits designed just for you. Start your journey with CSCMP today. Visit our website to learn more and join our global community.
Okay, so thank you for seeing the video. And last but not least, it is not mentioned in the video, but this year we have our European conference in Verona in June. So of course, you are all invited to join us in this wonderful event we organize every year. So from my side, that's it. Thank you very much. And now I pass on to Len to start our webinar of today. So thank you, guys.
Excellent. Thank you, Thomas. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's panel discussion on Asia sourcing, effective strategies during chaotic times, hosted by CSCMP, Portugal and Spain's Roundtables. I'm absolutely delighted to be moderating this conversation, because if there ever was a time for a long, hard look at global sourcing strategies, it's now. For decades, sourcing from Asia, especially China, was almost automatic. The logic was clear, cost-effective labor, scale, efficiency, and predictability. China became, as many have said, the factory of the world. But today, things do look different. Economic volatility, shifting tariffs, trade policy uncertainty, and geopolitical instability have disrupted what was once a relatively stable sourcing playbook. Add to that the Red Sea crisis, the ongoing logistics bottlenecks, and the continued aftershocks of COVID, and it's no wonder that companies are asking deeper questions about where and how their goods are made, moved, and managed. And here's the twist. This isn't the first time that global supply chains have been shaken up. History shows us that sourcing evolves in cycles. In the 1970s, it was about Japan. In the 80s, about the 4 Asian tigers. In the 90s and 2000s, China took the lead. And in the last decade, we've seen movements towards Vietnam, India, and more recently, Mexico. What's different now is the sheer complexity. Supply chain leaders are no longer just choosing the cheapest locations. They're navigating tariff walls, national security concerns, ESG scrutiny, infrastructure gaps, and freight volatility. And while China Plus One has become the buzzword over the last few years, it's not a clean or simple pivot. The reality is more nuanced. Many firms that source from, say, Vietnam, India, or Mexico still rely heavily on components, raw materials, and equipment from China. And in that sense, China remains an essential link, even if it's no longer the only one. So where does that leave us? Well, today's conversation will dig into some of those big questions that supply chain leaders are wrestling with right now. And to help us with that, I'm joined by this great panel of industry experts to bring clarity to those issues. You'll hear perspectives rooted in data, experience, and lived reality, both from their organizations that have already shifted sourcing strategies and those people who are watching the horizon for what's coming next. So before we start, gentlemen, if I could ask you to briefly introduce yourselves. Dan, we'll start with you.
Dan Krasenstein. I'm the Global Supply Chain Director for Procon Pacific out of the United States. I live in Portugal, and I spend a lot of time in India. My literally 40 years of global supply chain experience has taken me on the same journey Len just spoke about. I lived in Taiwan in the mid-'80s. I lived in China twice in the 90s and noughts. I've lived in the States. I've been in Latin America in between. So I've seen this global supply chain shift. I've seen this movie before. And history absolutely repeats itself, initially driven by labor cost differentials, and then with let's say geopolitical indications as well. So somebody who's witnessed history can look at the future perhaps with more 2020 vision. So that's my introduction. Over to you, Tom.
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. So my name is Tom van der Heyden. I'm a Belgian living in sunny Barcelona, Spain, where for the last 20 odd years, I've been the co-founder and CEO of S3 Strategic Sourcing Solutions, whereby we focus on indeed Asian sourcing with a strong particular focus on China, but looking also at alternatives, of course, for our European customers. And I'm really happy to be part of this event, and very honored to be a panelist on board.
Excellent. Thank you both. For those watching, as the conversation moves along, if you have any questions, please add them into the Q&A panel, and we'll look to get to them at the end of the discussion. Whether you're a procurement executive, a logistics leader, a supply chain strategist, or simply trying to make sense of where your next factory or supply chain node should be, this session is designed to give you insight, frameworks, and a big dose of realism. So with that, let's dive in. I'll start by posing our first question to the panel. So Dan, let's start with you. For decades, Asia, particularly China, has been the beating heart of global sourcing, as I said in the intro. But with economic shifts, reshoring, nearshoring trends, are we seeing the beginning of a true global rebalancing? Is Asia still the world's factory, or are we entering a new sourcing paradigm?
Len, the answer is yes and no. So essentially, China's not going anywhere. And why do I say that? Yes, it's true. The US market, in particular, my background, is trying to untangle or detangle itself from China. So what does that mean? It doesn't mean you go from 40% of containerized import to zero. It might drop to 25%, but it's not that simple of an answer. You have to really look at China's own domestic market, China's markets to Asia and the rest of the world as they grow. So in other words, China will still be manufacturing at scale, at huge economies of scale with these large production facilities, just perhaps de-emphasizing the reliance on the United States and Europe to a lesser degree. So in other words, first answer to your question is no, China's not going anywhere. However, if you look particularly at the US market, certain production has already shifted 10 plus years ago. For example, my own industry, going back around 12 years ago, we started shifting some of the production from China, initially to Vietnam, and then on to India. And that was pre-Trump 1. That had to do with labor cost. The cost of labor in China went from about $250 a month for a typical blue-collar factory worker to today over $1,200. And it was a straight line scale. So when it hit around $600 to $700 a month, that's when it made sense for labor-intensive industries like garments, industrial textiles, footwear, to already shift to lower cost countries like Vietnam, and as their costs went up, onwards to India. So that's part of the answer. The other part of the answer goes to your point about geopolitical change and then tariffs more recently, where it just exacerbates the cost differentials. And when you get to certain production, Mexico makes more sense. So a lot of the very wise Chinese manufacturers shifted some of their production very early on to Mexico to take advantage of the free trade accord and the proximity to reduce some of the geopolitical risk, some of the risks after COVID, the Suez Canal concerns. By positioning yourself in Mexico, you're dealing with much higher labor costs, but you're eliminating some of the risks. So back to the first point, China's not going anywhere. And when you hear the buzzword China plus one, China's still there. It's just plus one. So China plus what? It doesn't mean China zero. It just means China de-emphasized, but it's still absolutely there. As you rightly said earlier, Vietnam, Mexico, it gets a lot of its raw material, a lot of its semi-finished components from China still. Even India still gets a lot of its machinery is still coming from China. The amount of intra-Asia trade is ginormous. So China still plays a very key role in the global trade, just a little bit de-emphasized, if that answers your question, Len.
Thanks, Dan. Tom, what are your views? I mean, and sort of building on that, what are some of the misconceptions about moving supply chains out of not just China, but out of Asia as well, as we've seen in the last few years?
Well, I agree with pretty much everything that Dan has commented just the last few minutes, but I would like to add in an answer to your question a bit of a European perspective. Mm-hmm. And then the view is a little bit different, you know. Indeed, obviously in the US, it's not only about maybe keeping up with lower costs, looking for other places and all this. There's also a very important political background that we need to take into account, and today even more than ever. But in Europe, the situation is slightly different. We do not have the same political pressure, maybe on corporations to look for alternative sources. Costs are, of course, a big factor. But for instance, we do not have a Mexico next doors in Europe. We may have Turkey, which is not exactly the same thing, not the same size. Politically also maybe not the ideal partner. We have Morocco next doors, but it's also much smaller. There's nothing compared to, in that sense, to Mexico itself. So we're probably more stuck with China, and for many reasons. No, not only because we don't have that alternative that I just mentioned in the shape of Mexico, but for a number of reasons, totally in line with what Dan just said. China is not going anywhere. China is actually still probably right now becoming again very competitive for a number of reasons. Its domestic market is definitely not as strong as it used to be. It has its struggles trying to supply to America due to the tariffs and the political environment. So China is doing its best to be still very competitive. And it is not only because of costs, but if you look at, it's not so difficult to find on the internet, interview with Tim Cook that is over 10 years old, where he said that it's a misconception that people go to China for the low cost. At that time already, just as Dan said, China wasn't anymore that low cost anymore, but it's the skill set, the combination of so many skills you have there, the clusters that are in China, and the infrastructure, of course, that is unmatched anywhere else, even in the West. All of that creates a combination that indeed creates an environment whereby it's so hard to get away from China. Okay, and if there's less of a political pressure in Europe compared to what it is in the US, and we do not have a Mexico next doors, it makes it much harder for European corporations to try to look into that China plus one. Which one? Not as even to talk of a China plus two. Which two? It's not that obvious.
I absolutely agree, and the interview is that with Tim Cook, you can find it on YouTube, is absolutely spot on, talking about the number of engineers that they graduate per year, for example. That's absolutely right. Looking a bit more widely outside of pure sourcing, it's no longer just a question nowadays about where things are made. It's about how they move. In the way that the world moves so quickly. Even this morning, we've had a major earthquake in Thailand, and the repercussions from that are still not going to be certain for a few days yet. With global disruptions in shipping, in energy prices, and infrastructure, how are companies rethinking their logistics, their warehousing, their distribution strategies to make sourcing more resilient? Tom, we'll start with you.
Well, that's a very tough one. Definitely, indeed, there's so many factors now on the table, a couple of those that you mentioned right now, that are making it much more complicated for companies to set up these supply chains and to handle them in an efficient way. No, again, before the China plus one, as you mentioned in your introduction, almost total dependency on China. It had, of course, its geopolitical risks. That's why, of course, in the US, there's a certain political movement, but it was so comfortable. It was so easy. You could also work with different suppliers in the country, consolidate loads. It was so smooth. Nowadays, it's a struggle. It's a struggle for a number of reasons, but to set this up in an efficient way, it becomes so hard because also, actually, I should mention, Thomas brought up in the video was mentioned the CSMP Edge conference. I was at last year's Edge conference in Nashville, and I was actually almost blown away by seeing so many presentations, also academic presentations on the first day, whereby it was highlighted how following the trend of going to other countries, and setting up factories in different places and using suppliers in other places, how it became so hard for senior management in a lot of US corporations to make that puzzle work. Okay, a lot of presentations, and I found it from a European perspective very interesting, were about the struggle between C-suite, CEOs, CFOs, and all the like, who have probably a little bit of pressure of sort of making moves, and then senior management trying to work things out on the floor, on the real operative context. And you could see how there was a lot of tensions between these two levels. And because indeed for senior management in a lot of corporations, it is like really juggling with a lot of different pieces of a puzzle, and it is absolutely complicated to get things to work out when you have nowadays you have maybe moved operations to Vietnam, you have moved operations to India, maybe a couple of suppliers in Turkey, obviously some nearshoring in Mexico for American corporations, and still stuck with a few that are irreplaceable in China. The whole consolidation of loads becomes an almost impossible exercise. And you need to really integrate a lot with logistics operators and freight forwarders to make this work from a very different perspective as it used to be.
And Dan, I'm wondering here, we've heard, as Tom said, we talk about nearshoring a lot and friendshoring as well, which is one of the other moves. What role does this regional warehousing and reshoring play in the modern sourcing strategies that we're seeing with not just China, but Asia generally?
Well, Len, I'll answer that, but I'll also go back to how you phrased it to Tom, in the sense the role logistics plays in this change. The key operative term, as many of us know from our supply chain background, is S&OP, sales and operations planning. Mm-hmm. So if you're shifting from a China to a Mexico or China to a Vietnam or India or a combination, you really have to make sure your sales team, the one communicating with your customer internally and externally, is aligned with the reality of how you've mapped your supply chain. So for example, if prior to the Suez Canal situation being closed, you had a 28-day transit time from a Mundra, India into a New York, now you have to recalibrate and say, no, we got 39-day transit time. And that's fine, as long as it's dependable. You plan accordingly. You increase your safety stock at your warehouse, whether it be in Mexico or the United States for the US market. So as long as you recalibrate the transit time and the frequency of the goods flow, you can go with the flow. You can make it work. The challenge really comes to how flexible are you? How agile are you for the next supply chain disruption? Be it an earthquake, be it a war, be it a natural occurrence of a typhoon, whatever it happens to be. And then you throw in there the other variable of political tariffs, like reciprocity of duties that Trump too is now going to impose on various markets. Then you got to shift again. Again, supply chain practitioners are well known for being able to move on a dime, to being agile and reacting to changes. And that affects warehousing, that affects logistics. But it goes deeper than that, because take a look at the shift for the US market from a China to an India. China traditionally moves its cargo from a Shanghai, Qingdao, or Southern China in Yantian or Hong Kong area to an LA, Long Beach, Oakland, or Tacoma via the Pacific Ocean. India does not. India typically shifts either through the Suez or under the Cape of Good Hope to the US East Coast. Well, that change requires you to relook at how you move cargo. Where should your warehouses be? Previously, they were in Southern California. Now you really have to look at Norfolk, Virginia, Charleston, South Carolina, Baltimore, Maryland, or New York, New Jersey. Where do you put your warehouses for your onward distribution, and what safety stock you need? You also have to look at other areas. For example, to the US Gulf Coast of Houston and New Orleans, there really is no really good service from India. Everything requires a transshipment. You just got to pick where that transshipment is. And I'm not a big fan of transshipments, but sometimes you have no choice. The other thing you have to take a look at when you shift from a China to other countries is holidays, seasonality. In India, you're dealing with rainy season, marriage season, Holi, Diwali, a whole set of different holidays than simply Chinese New Year. And so take a look at when you're making these shifts, how aligned and how integrated your operations planning people are and your salespeople. And you have to reset how you sell it to your customer in terms of lead times and how much flexibility you need to have in your whole supply chain management program.
I'm wondering, chaps, we've been talking about the reshaping of the logistics chains and the flow. Picking up one of the questions that's come up, what do you think about the possibility of Africa sourcing? I was talking with one supply chain director recently, and he said there's been a move. You mentioned, Tom, Europe. There's been a move from Eastern Europe to Turkey, now beginning to see Egypt and North Africa. Is that something that really does seem that it's a wave happening that way that will complement the Asia option?
It is and it isn't. Again, I would give an answer like the yes or no that Dan started with in his first question. And I would also like to briefly add that when Dan was talking about the 39 days to New York, I almost started crying. Because nowadays from Shanghai to Western Europe, door to door, not maybe on the seas, but door to door, you quickly get to 8 weeks. So that's a different ballgame. But anyway, to answer your question, Lynn, yes, Africa. Indeed, some players are looking into that more. Yet, one should take into account for the time being the shortcomings of that option. Of course, no. I mean, there is talk of will Africa be the next East Asia? I mean, I have a soft spot for Africa, and I would love to see that happen. But unfortunately, reality for the time being is different. No, apart from political stability, instability, a factor that people barely take into account is in order to start up some industrial activity, which usually starts with textiles and the like, with cheap labor, you need cheap labor. And most people would think, well, obviously Africa probably has cheap labor. Well, it doesn't. Because of labor legislation in Africa, if Bangladesh would be 100 as just a value, in a lot of African countries, you would get to 200 or 250 to make it comparable. Only one of the few countries that stands out would be Ethiopia. And it's no surprise that Ethiopia has actually a sizable industry. No, so it's not that obvious. You also lack quite a bit of infrastructure. And curiously enough, the few countries that are heavily investing in infrastructure in Africa is, yes, China. No, China is investing in railroads and other infrastructure, which is helping that situation. No, very often because it's Chinese who are investing in industrial development in Africa. So it is becoming in a few places an option. But still a bit of homework needs to be done in that respect. And it might be, for instance, if you are active in textile specifically, then yes, there are a number of African countries who definitely are becoming an important player. I was having, again, in that last CSCMP Edge conference, I was having an interesting conversation with a fellow sourcing entrepreneur in the US, and they are very focused on textiles. And whereas we struggle to find valid alternatives for a wide variety of our Chinese suppliers, he was actually working with 40 countries. I cannot even imagine that. But the secret is that they are very focused on textiles. And then it's then it's more likely that you can end up with maybe 10, 15 countries in Africa that could do a good job for you, no? But if it's already hard to move certain electronics and all these sort of things out of China, moving them to Africa, we're still a while away from that, I'm afraid.
Yeah, and I think, Tom, that point about the geopolitics is absolutely key. We've seen in the last 10, 15 years, China, as you rightly point out, have moved quite significantly in doing a lot of the development in Africa, particularly in areas where raw materials are absolutely critical. They've done likewise with Latin America as well. And this issue of geopolitics, without wanting to dive into it, I think the moves that we're seeing globally in the last few months with a withdrawing in international development is leaving a vacuum. And at the moment, there's really only one player that has the wherewithal to follow that in. So picking up on that point, Dan, and you mentioned it before, we used to think about sourcing decisions in terms of cost, quality and efficiency. That's probably not the situation anymore. Today, political risk, trade wars, tariffs, which we see everyday news stories about, and shifting alliances and partnerships seem to be just as important. So how much are geopolitics actually driving sourcing decisions? And if I could ask you to prognosticate, what should businesses expect in the next 5 years?
Thanks for the easy question, Lynn. Essentially, expect the unexpected. And when you plan your supply chain, you really have to build agility into it. Essentially, here's the point. All these tariffs that have already been applied towards China from the United States and the threat of more tariffs just accelerates the shift which was already on the way because of labor cost. At the end of the day, it's landed duty paid. What's your full-on cost? And tariffs are just another cost. And what that does, it forces you to calculate, can I pass the cost on to my consumer, which means inflation, which is an inevitable result of tariffs. Okay, where do I go next? And the problem is, here we are at March 28th, on April 2, Liberation Day in the United States, what Trump has termed it, there's going to be a lot of reciprocal tariffs applied across the globe. And it's a Russian roulette game. We really don't know what's next. I was in India, just got back a couple of days ago, speaking with 10 of my suppliers in India, and they really don't know what to expect. India sees itself as a geopolitical ally of the United States for a variety of reasons. It sees itself as the natural successor to China as being a low-cost labor manufacturer. It sees itself as aligned as possible with what United States' goals are, and it wants to export more finished goods to the US market. The challenge is, if it's being tasked with lowering its import duties on, say, for example, agriculture, is that a fair ask? Is that something Modi can really pull off domestically within India? And the answer is maybe not. Well, if it bought more weapons and it bought more gas and other products from the US and it lowered its duty on Harley-Davidson motorcycles and Kentucky bourbon, would that be enough? We just don't know. So the answer to your question is, we just don't know. So you really have to build agility into your supply chain. There's also a lot of non-tariff barriers out there. You have the UHRPA targeting Xinjiang in Western China, where US importers with operations and billions of dollars invested in China manufacturing today really don't know when they export something to the United States. Are they guilty until proven innocent, and they have to prove origin of the raw materials? That's a key concern. And on top of that, you really don't know when the Red Sea and the opening to the Suez Canal will be reliable again. My best source is saying Q1 26, but even that's a guess. So the answer to your question is, there's a lot of unknowns out there.
Tom, I'm wondering here if there's been a lot of talk in the last few weeks about the decoupling of the US from European organizations, and I'm wondering, we've been talking about resourcing away from Asia, but actually, are we going to see a situation where organizations are going to think better the devil you know and actually look east to replace some of those Western chains?
Absolutely. I'm not sure if everybody's happy about that, even in Europe, but the way things have been moving in the last barely 2 months, that would have been, I mean, your question, if we would have had this webinar just merely a few months ago, I mean, you would have asked this question, we would probably all looked at each other, so what's happening to Len? No, why does he ask this? It's like kind of totally impossible, no? And now it's a fair question. It's absolutely a fair question. It goes even further. And I mean, although it's not really in the context of trade, I know a pretty up-to-date observer in Belgium who's very much on top of things related to China. And he's been saying for a while, and I hear him actually almost saying it now almost every day, in NATO, we should replace the US with China. And it's sort of, what do you say? But I mean, if you think a little bit of certain logic, I mean, I wouldn't think it really would be a viable option. But just as Canada said, we can no longer maybe trust our neighbor in the south. No? So things have been really bubbling up in an awkward way. So in answer to your question, yes, on the one hand, Europe seems to be being pushed away from the US, and China is more than happy to welcome that new relationship. Is making also certain moves to be the sort of that welcoming new neighbor. A lot has to be discussed. I mean, Ukraine and other situations need to be clarified, but definitely it is something indeed that Whether we like it or not, it seems to be a sort of normal evolution that we're heading to. Absolutely, Lynn.
I think sort of building on all of this, one of the big lessons is that sourcing nowadays has to do that horizon scanning. This isn't something that can be just left for the big tier one companies. Sourcing departments, even for smaller national firms, needs to have an idea of what's going on in the bigger picture, and organizations like CSCMP can help that, and other professional bodies as well. If we were to continue look at where the pieces have been falling of late, as well as China, who will Asia's biggest sourcing competitors be? Who are the underestimated countries that actually have an awful lot of potential in that region? Dan, should we try with you first?
Yes, we shall. So I think, the obvious answer is India. India, in the sense that it has the population, it has the desire to play that role. And in many ways, it is China's adversary. So it's a natural next up batter in a cricket match, if you were. So the point is, it's not a given. India still faces its own challenges. It has infrastructure improvement required. It's proven it can. You can take the western state of Gujarat, where the manufacturing area of Ahmedabad is, and I've seen the rail and the highway and even the airport and the ocean port, the seaport infrastructure driven by the Adani Group and their investment and expertise there. It's proven it can be first class, world class in terms of infrastructure improvement. The rest of India needs to catch up. If India is going to play that role, they need to have dependable electricity. They need to have stable labor. It needs to have the ability for the big ocean carriers to want to call that deep sea port on a dependable weekly basis and not ad hoc. It needs to have a reliable routing to move cargo from India to the key markets of the world and be able to reroute in the case of a Suez, for example, or even the Panama Canal for that matter. So India is, in my mind, is the obvious next one up, but a lot of work needs to be done. The second part of the answer is there's no single answer. China will remain as is. India will take a piece of it, a sliver of it, and so will Mexico. Mexico is the natural one to de-risk your supply chain. If you can manufacture in Mexico and you keep an eye on your raw material, your components, your production, you can rely it's going to show up in 2 days from Mexico. But at a higher cost, Mexico, of course, has to keep its eye on its violence, its gang wars, its own stability. But in general, I'd say India and Mexico are the two obvious big player winners for the North American market. Tom would be in a better position to answer for the Europe market. But there's still a lot of variables at play. And I'd say the biggest one right now would be the reciprocal tariffs threatened by the Trump administration, as well as the next black swan event, whatever that happens to be.
Tom, that sounded like the ball was passed to you on Europe.
Indeed.
Well, I totally agree with Dan's analysis, maybe for one, except for one point. From a US perspective, indeed. Definitely the pressure to move away from China will keep on going, and so indeed India could be a first option. There are options. There are other options as well, like Mexico. But as I already mentioned before, for Europe the picture is not that simple, actually it becomes even less simple because it may sound contradictory, but under the current market conditions, and I refer to the weak demand in China, one should not forget that in February, it has been now 24 months in a row that consumer confidence is below 50. 24 months in a row. Okay, that's a long time. So the market is not entirely recovering. The real estate situation is still very complex. So there's a lot of pressure on companies to find their way out. Okay, and since the government has been pushing quite a bit into helping the industry, there's a lot of overcapacity now in China. Who's the victim here? Turns out for the time being, and I've seen we have people attending out of Vietnam, out of Saigon. Southeast Asia seems to be taking the beating here, being flooded by Chinese products. Maybe one of our attendees can give comments about that. And so as a consequence, China's back in a sense, no? The cheap China's back, which sounds like totally contradictory because indeed with, I always make this comparison here. The average salary in Shanghai is higher than the average salary in Spain. So those are important numbers. And the point that I have a little bit of disagreement maybe with Dan, but we shouldn't agree on all things, of course. I'm not entirely sure if India is already ready to pick up that role from China. I think there's still a lot to do. And I put that horizon a little bit further away. Okay, so to use a little bit the words of Martin Jacques, used to be linked to Cambridge, and he earlier, I think a couple of months ago, he gave this speech where he said the next China is still China. I kind of agree a little bit with that, particularly from a European perspective, of course, because we don't have that tariff situation for the time being, of course.
Excellent. Chaps, that's the end of the sort of formal panel discussion. I'll turn to some of the questions that people have sent us in as we've been talking about. Some of them we have addressed. If anybody would like to throw in a question, please do put it into the Q&A or the chat boxes, and we'll try to get to them today. So the first one coming in from Luis Martin. He asks a bit about US sourcing. Is the future really China plus 100, and for Europe, China plus 2 plus 3? I think we've hit that several times in the discussion. But he does go on to ask, beyond diversification, how can companies design sourcing strategies that work hand in hand with customs compliance rather than treat it as an afterthought? I think this is an interesting question because this whole picture of looking at the fuller picture, the fuller sourcing information set, seems to be something that more organizations need to do. Dan, what's your experience here?
Well, I think the operative part of Luis's question was customs compliance. So what does that mean? To me, that means, yes, a tariff, rightly applying the correct tariff to the goods. For example, if majority of the components are coming from China and are shipped to Mexico for simple assembly, how would U.S. Customs properly tariff that product as a Chinese product or Mexico product? That's a key concern. And the other part I mentioned before with the UHRPA risks and other compliance issues, your product might get prohibited from entry. So that's all part of the mapping of supply chain risk. How do you remain compliant, pay the proper tariff? And it's not just going for the lower cost manufacturing, because manufacturing is part of the supply chain. So is the logistics, so is customs clearance, and so is last mile delivery. You have to look at the whole supply chain holistically, not just one component. So I think the question is spot on. You really have to look at sourcing as the role it plays in your entire program.
Tom, this feels a little bit like, and I think US companies are learning the same lessons that we saw in Brexit, where UK companies now had to really break down their bill of materials, understand exactly the origins of all of their components and ingredients that went into those assemblies. Are we seeing this customs compliance now being used more widely as one of the factors?
Oh, definitely. And I'm afraid that it's almost being more and more, and allow me a dramatic expression, weaponized, no, for political purposes, no. So that is, and it's a pity because I think not only us four here, but most likely, if you're interested in this particular webinar, also all attendees are interested in basically free trade or easy trade, global trade. And it's amazing to see how these things are popping up now and making the environment much more complex. No, a little bit to complement what Dan just answered a moment ago. I mean, uncertainty is the key word here. Just a couple of weeks ago, I happened to be at another event in the US, in Long Beach this time, and I mean, together with LA, the entry place for the US for most of the imports. No, during that same event, where actually also Dan was a speaker, during that event, in the middle of the event was the day when the Trump administration formalized the 25% of tariffs on Canada and Mexico, right? And obviously, in the entire event, literally everybody walking around me was related somehow to free trade, to international trade, no? And it was amazing how to to see how people were trying to cope with that. Even days before, I had been in touch with people in Mexico, said, no, it's not going to happen. The 25% is not going to happen. Well, boom. While we were there, it was happening, no? And as a little bit as a reaction, I mean, in times of stress, having a little laugh is maybe the only way to relax things. I noticed, and I'm not sure if Dan remembers that, a lot of people on that particular day, which was a Tuesday, a lot of people in the morning would say hello, saying Happy Tariff Day, as sort of a way of let's at least laugh a little bit at it. No, I mean, there's obviously nothing to be happy about that, but it's a way of saying we have no clue what's coming up at us. No, and in answer to Luis's question, we'll probably have to be much more focused in the future of the day-to-day developments, but it's going to be harder and harder to build longer-term supply chains. No, it's so complicated. You never know what the day of tomorrow will bring. I mean, look at the 25% now for cars that are not made in the US. I thought that Germany would be the big victim, but I saw that it's actually Mexico, Canada, Japan, and South Korea are even standing in front of that queue. No, so it's really hard. It's really hard.
It is, and the complexity thing is one of the things I think we've had to face of late, but it hasn't got easier. I'm wondering here, there's a question from Pedro. How can companies leverage digitization and advanced analytics to improve transparency and efficiency in Asia sourcing? Not just with what we've been talking about, but especially in the context of evolving ESG regulations. Tom, what's your view on this? I personally see the use of AI agents is increasingly being used to map data sets and pull out information and present patterns, present warning signs that we might not have picked up before. How are you seeing that being leveraged by companies of all sizes, not just the big guys?
I do agree. I think it's more than a fair point. And I do think companies indeed have to invest into better tools, better software to try to understand better what's going on and get the inputs and try to work with them. And that will help them at least a little bit into managing and navigating that uncertainty, you know. The issue that I see with that, and I don't want to be too negative in it, but the issue that I see with it, and I'm quite sure that then with his experiences living in so many different places that are relevant for this conversation, I'm quite sure that he will agree with me. The problem here is not so much with how the data are being processed and what are the conclusions that we get out of them. The problem is with how reliable are the data that we're getting. In quite a few of the countries that have been mentioned in the last 45 minutes, the official data are not always super reliable, okay? And so if you do have inputs about labor costs or growth of economies or certain industries, investment flows and all the like, when that type of information is not always entirely reliable, obviously your starting point is weak, no? And then you can do with AI whatever you want, but if AI only works if the data are good. I would just like to warn that, okay, I like the idea, and I think the question is very good because it goes in the right direction as a tool to at least lower a little bit the impact of other uncertainties like geopolitical ones. But take into account, make sure that the data you put in the system are good, okay? But otherwise, you're wasting your time.
Excellent. Dan, if I can fold into that question as well, one from Mikhail, which is what are the key red flags or early indicators to watch for to anticipate and mitigate sourcing risks in the Asia region? The digitization, the advanced analytics will be part of that. But to Tom's point, there will be some issues. There will be some warnings, even in the inputs into some of those as well, that we need to pick up. What's your view?
I'll add on to what Tom said about the role of AI. I think people are misinterpreting the AI value to our supply chain. It is a tool. It's not replacing a supply chain analyst. So as you have tools, you value them. As Tom rightly said, how reliable is it as a tool? I think it's very good as a tool to alert you to a trend, to something you might have missed in the data, for you as a human to dig deeper into it. So I like AI as a tool only, again, not as a decision maker. I do want to touch on the other point you mentioned in the question regarding the role of ESG. In Europe and United States, they're going two different directions. ESG in North America, especially in the United States, I should say, under the Trump 2 administration, is being de-emphasized. It's almost taboo. Whereas in Europe, it's still very, very important. You want to leave the world a better place for your grandkids, right? Whether it's the sustainability aspect, the environment, and good governance. And it's almost like if you're a supplier from an India, from a China, Vietnam, or Mexico for that matter, you almost have to have a different ESG strategy for each market. In the US, you don't mention it. In Europe, you put it first. And if you're a German manufacturer who sells to the US market, you're really in a challenging position to decide, well, I guess I can't use the same ad promoting my ESG as they do in Europe as they do in the United States. So AI, ESG were two of your questions. The digitization part of it, sure, it's just another tool. It's a better way for an analyst to look at their supply chain, and data should speak. You can have your gut opinion and you have your tribal knowledge, but at the end of the day, you have to back it up, and you have to do that by data. So if you can digitize your supply chain and give yourself better data to analyze, more power to you.
Yes, and absolutely. This point of ESG and the divergence of it, I'm beginning to build up a thesis that most supply chain professionals now don't really talk about sustainable supply chains, because sustainability has ultimately the same goals as supply chains: to do as much as you can with as little as possible and leave as little waste behind as you can. And the risk part of that, which naturally fits within the ESG umbrella, is increasingly being part of how do we make supply chains resilient. I am concerned that we're seeing language, particularly coming out of the States, where even this week we've had policymakers in Florida talking about using children to replace some of the migrant labor that's being moved outside of the US. That's the state of affairs that we've got into. Looking more widely, the complexity of Asia, and even within China as well. You know, China's not just one country. There are regional variations and local variations. How can companies build strategic and long-term relationships, asks Dora. Dan, you've got such a long experience of working across not just China but India as well. How can companies really build those strategic and long-term relationships?
It really comes down to local politics, state politics, or province, if you will, and federal. Within China, when I was in Jiangsu province or Shandong province, you would meet with the local officials when you're talking about plant infrastructure and import-export trade, and they really knew what they were talking about, and they would supply you the water, the electricity, the land, and have access to labor, and be very supportive, because those local government officials had their KPIs driven by these same points. How much are we supporting labor? How much are we exporting and thus taxing our local manufacturers? So just like in China, India feels the same way with its states, China being provinces, India being states, as the US uses states. States play a very powerful role. The state of Gujarat is very export oriented, very industry focused. Other states in India are more agriculture. You have your federal government policy, but if you can build those relations on the state to state level, that's really the way to go in the long run, and just make sure those states are aligned with federal policy. On that same theme, getting back to ESG, I do want to clarify a point I made earlier. Whilst federally in the US these days, ESG is not so popular, various states, for example, California, it's front and foremost. So in many ways, the comments recently made by Canada being more aligned with the European Union, I think many in California would want to be on that same train.
Tom, your view on building up these relationships?
Well, if you don't mind, Lynn, I'm not entirely sure if we answered Miguel's question about the red flags. So we kind of diverged a little bit into another direction, and I had, if that's all right with you, I think, I mean, definitely red flags are an important thing to keep in mind. But in answer to this question, I think most of them are quite still similar to what used to be relevant. Although we have, of course, the added current geopolitical context, whereby tariffs both ways could be something to be taken into account and might become like a total trade war situation where everybody tries to hit everybody, you know? So hopefully we don't get to that point, but as I think has been already mentioned several times the last hour or so, that nobody knows, no? But overall, I think I would definitely like to, in order to identify the red flags, or new red flags, I should say, apart from the common ones that sourcing folks are always interested in, I definitely believe that peer-to-peer communication is very important here, okay? Events like today, I'm not sure, I hope we contributed some interesting insights to our audience, but peer-to-peer information is very important, and organizations like CSMP definitely plays an important role, no? I mean, these are focal points where, I mean, all the different roundtables in the US, the 10 different roundtables in Europe and beyond, definitely those are places where if events are organized, whether they're face-to-face or online, there's always interesting information to find. People who've had experiences that maybe have been a bit traumatic or things that actually run very well, and that you can say, hey, give me more information and maybe we can try something similar for our company, you know? So I think this is a time whereby reaching out to each other among, I mean, supply chain management professionals, sourcing professionals, more than ever, this is a time is not to be simply looking at what we've been doing over the last couple of years, but what have the neighbors been doing, no? What our colleagues, sometimes maybe competitors, but just reaching out and finding out what they have been doing and learn some lessons from this, because there's definitely a lot of information going around and the environment is changing very rapidly, no?
Tom, thank you very much. I couldn't have actually finished on a higher note. I think your point is absolutely valid. We're coming to the top of the hour. The conversation doesn't stop today. It continues in our own peer networks, in our own roundtables as well. If you'd like to get involved, please do reach out to us. I'm very sure both the Portuguese, the Spanish, and other roundtables would welcome your conversation and contributions. Please do keep it going. So on behalf of the Portugal and Spain roundtables, obrigado, gracias. Thomas, back to you.
You're on mute, Thomas.
You're still muted.
We had to get it in once, Thomas.
Sorry. No, guys, really outstanding panel. It was great. Maybe we need to have a round 2 about this topic, because we could speak about this like for hours. So thank you for joining. Just a quick reminder, remember we have our Edge conference this year in Maryland in October, and then of course European conference in Verona. So you're all invited to join there. And thank you for joining. Of course, thank you, Tom and Dan. Really pleasure to hear you about talking about this topic.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, guys, and everyone. Bye-bye.